From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hi, I'm Gail Shirazi of the Israel Judaica section here at the Library of Congress. Welcome to our program today, Reading Claudius, a book and author talk by Caroline Heller. This event is being co-sponsored by the European Division, the Hebrew Language Table of the Library of Congress, in cooperation with the Czech Embassy. I would like to thank Grant Harris and the European Division, Audrey Fisher and the Public Affairs Office, Galina Tevorovsky and Chaim Golchak of the IJ section at the library, and Mary Fetsko at the Embassy of the Czech Republic. And I'd like to thank Mary Bisbee Beck, Caroline's publisher, and of course our speaker, Caroline Heller. Dr. Heller is director of the interdisciplinary Ph.D. program in educational studies at Lesley University. She's also a professor in the Graduate School of Education. Dr. Heller has a BA from the University of Chicago, an MFA from Bennington College, and a doctorate in education from the University of California at Berkeley. One of her areas of interest is the connection of reading, writing, and storytelling to selfhood, particularly for refugee populations. Reading Claudius presents a vivid, and for me, a visual picture of refugee life in Europe, particularly Prague, and then following it to the Americas, where her family came as refugees. When I read her book, I felt like I was sitting, as I told Caroline, right in the cafe next to these people. It let me enter the book, and that happens so rarely with Holocaust literature. Usually you're reading somebody else's. But this really, thank you, Carolyn, for making it so vivid and alive. So I would like to thank Carolyn again, and the floor is all yours.
I have no announcements. So thank you so much for coming, and Gail, thank you for making this happen. And of all the many sponsors, I particularly want to thank the Czech Embassy, and you will find out very shortly, if you haven't read Reading Claudius, what that country meant to both my parents. It is crazy wonderful to be reading at the Library of Congress. It is unbelievable, really. And there are people in the audience I haven't seen in a long time, and I want to particularly acknowledge Jody Bernstein, who was my mother's. You'll get to know my mother in a moment, but Jody was my mother's most beloved American friend, and Jody, that you're here means that my dad and mom are here.
Thank you.
And I don't think it's a spoiler alert to tell you that Washington, D.C. is a bit character in the book, because my brother and I were both born here at George Washington Hospital, and my father's first medical job was at Group Health in Washington, D.C., which was really the first, quasi-socialist, as some people like to say, medical world in this country. So I just want to make a few remarks about publishing one's first major book when one is a little older, as I am. It's a period of incredible joy and a sense of plenitude, that of all the people in the world who have important stories to tell, yours gets published and is bound in a beautiful cover and has a Library of Congress ISBN number and all of those wonderful things. But in addition, it was strangely discombobulating writing and researching this book for so long, most people know that that can be a very lonely time. But I was unprepared for the fact that really publishing a book is quite lonely as well, in that you're alone with this baby whom you care so much about, and it's it and you. And then suddenly this beloved organism is in the world, and you don't know who it's with, and you don't know if it's cared for properly and loved. And so occasions like this are really help a great deal in that particular sense of loneliness, because you're with the people who have read the book or will read the book, and all of that is really eased in one's heart and soul. So all of which is to say thank you again for coming. Well, my hope for writing Reading Claudius, it is both small and contained, to share a very personal family story, a kind of a elegy, a love letter to my parents. But it's also big and expansive in its own way to inspire readers of Reading Claudius to really think about how thought and history hover over all our lives in ways that we often don't fully understand or recognize. And most particularly, for those of us whose parents or grandparents or great-grandparents have experienced enormous political upheavals and dislocations, and sometimes threatening to destroy them, as in my parents' case, and afterwards must somehow recreate their coherence, their sense of themselves, and their sense of the future. And in the writing of Reading Claudius, I also recognize so fully that they also must, as Gail alluded to the next generation and refugees in America, they must also figure out how to imagine a future for their children in a land that they never anticipated raising their children in, because the land that they did think would always be theirs no longer existed. So I recognized that and adored my parents all over again with that recognition. In my own family's case, the political trauma, the historical crisis was World War II. And what was destroyed was my parents' beloved Central Europe, Prague in their lives, at the heart of that sense of Central Europe. So Reading Claudius, as Gail mentioned, is very much about that former world, that lost world, very much taking places in the cafes, the coffee houses that Gail alluded to, where in that place and during that time, the sense of the political and the intellectual and the creative and the artistic and the literary were all somehow one and the same. And I think many of us long for that kind of spirit in the United States. And in the coffee houses that my parents and uncles frequented, it was always, there were day-long and week-long, month-long debates, always to the intermingling with the smell of coffee and the abundant cigarette smoke. And I'm glad that Gail mentioned how visual that was, because I felt I was there too. Reading Claudius is also about memory. I had a kind of an epiphany about that, about the story being about memory, when my spouse and I saw the Laurie Anderson play Homeland some years ago, just when I was in the throes of finishing Reading Claudius. And the play opens with birds in the sky, and it's before there is land. It's before land exists. And the father and the mother bird die. And because there's no land, there's no place to bury them. And so Laurie Anderson says the daughter bird buries them in the back of her head. And she says that this is the beginning of memory. And I was just floored by that, because I realized in writing the book that I, and probably many of us, perhaps most of us, bury our parents in the backs of our heads. So reading Claudius is about that, and it's about how all those memories and meanings get communicated and bequeathed to the next generation, and all that gets lost along the way. And in my case, that was a great deal. So before I introduce the key players and read a little bit, many people ask me, why are you writing a book about the Emperor Claudius when this book supposedly is about Prague? And I just want to clue you in that it's not the emperor. Claudius in the title refers to Matthias Claudius, who is an old German poet, a 18th century poet, who many Central European children were weaned on. Everyone read Claudius's poems. They're very simple and quite beautiful, and I witnessed both my mother and father in the weeks before they died going back to a little book of his poems that my mother managed to get out of Europe, and read to each other Claudius poems. And that's what inspired the title, which my editor for a long time wanted to change, because she thought everyone will be looking for the emperor. And then in the end, had been reading Claudius for so long that she and I both said it's got to stay Reading Claudius. So that's how the title came to be. Well, Reading Claudius has 3 starring players. In part 2 of the book, my brother and I become a bit stars as well, but the 3 starring players are my mother, Lisa Florsheim, who came to Prague from Frankfurt, Germany in 1933, just as Hitler became chancellor, because she was no longer allowed to go on to higher education in Germany. And in Prague, she met a fellow medical student who would later become my father, Paul Heller. But while this fellow, Paul Heller, developed a very quiet, shy, but very big crush on Lisa, Lisa gave her heart to Paul's older brother, Eric, who was already kind of a literary figure and philosophy figure among the young Jewish students in Prague. He was an aspiring writer already, doing some publishing, and also the head of the socialist student movement. So Eric became quite prominent on the Nazis' radar. And thus began a combustible romantic triangle that would last a lifetime and show itself in various ways. And that forms the core of the personal story of Reading Claudius. And the war itself, of course, is the air that surrounds that triangle. In late summer of 1938, when the growing power of the Nazis made it very dangerous for German Jews to remain in Europe at all, my mother got out and made it to the United States. Some months later, my uncle, who, as I mentioned, was quite a prominent anti-Nazi, fled illegally across the Polish border and made it to safety in Cambridge, England. But a short time after that, and it was really just a matter of days after Paul's graduation from medical school, war broke out, and Paul was arrested in the middle of the night in the first public roundup in Prague and transported first to Dachau, then to Buchenwald, with a year spent in Auschwitz and then back to Buchenwald, and all in all remaining in the camps for 6 years until they were liberated in 1945. In doing research for the book, I made many trips to Europe, and in one of those, I interviewed one of the remaining surviving friends of my parents' European friends, and she told me in great detail about the Sunday afternoon when she and my uncle and everyone listening to the radio that night found out that my father had survived. And so I want to play a short broadcast that was part of a postscript for the Sunday BBC News this evening that no one in the group that was with Eve Adler-Rode knew that this was to be aired that evening. They didn't yet know that Paul had survived.
April 15th, 1945.
Permit me to tell you what you would have seen and heard had you been with me on Thursday. It will not be pleasant listening. If you're at lunch, or if you have no appetite to hear what Germans have done, now is a good time to switch off the radio. For I propose to tell you of Buchenwald. It is on a small hill about 4 miles outside Weimar, and it was one of the largest concentration camps in Germany, and it was built to last. As we approached it, we saw about 100 men in civilian clothes with rifles, advancing in open order across a field. There were a few shots. We stopped to inquire. We're told that some of the prisoners had a couple of SS men cornered in there. We drove on, reached the main gate. The prisoners crowded up behind the wire. We entered. And now let me tell this in the first person, for I was the least important person there, as you shall hear. There surged around me an evil-smelling abhorrence. Men and boys reached out to touch me. They were in rags and the remnants of uniform. Death had already marked many of them, but they were smiling with their eyes. I looked out over that mass of men to the green fields beyond, where well-fed Germans were plowing. A German, Fritz Kirchheimer, came up and said, "May I show you around the camp? I've been here 10 years. An Englishman stood to attention saying, "May I introduce myself? Delighted to see you. And can you tell me when some of our blokes will be along?" I told him soon, and asked to see one of the barracks. It happened to be occupied by Czechoslovakians. When I entered, men crowded around, tried to lift me to their shoulders. They were too weak. Many of them could not get out of bed. I was told that this building had once stabled 80 horses. There were 1,200 men in it, 5 to a bunk. The stink was beyond all description. When I reached the center of the barracks, a man came up and said, "You remember me. I'm Peter Zenkel, one-time mayor of Prague." I remembered him, but did not recognize him. He asked about Benish and Jan Mathering. I asked how many men had died in that building during the last month. They called the doctor. We inspected his records. There were only names in the little black book, nothing more. Nothing who these men were, what they had done, or hoped. Behind the names of those who had died, there was a cross. I counted them. They totaled 242. 242 out of 1,200 in 1 month. As I walked down to the end of the barracks, there was applause from the men too weak to get out of bed. It sounded like the hand clapping of babies. They were so weak. The doctor's name was Paul Heller. He had been there since 38.
Well, I just want to read a couple of sections, short sections from the book, one from part 1 and one from part 2, and then I hope very much to engage in conversation and invite you to ask questions. This first section takes place in part 1 of the book, and it takes place right after the infamous Munich Agreement, which most of you know ceded the northwest part of Czechoslovakia to Hitler in order to appease his thirst for power. Czechoslovakia was quite weakened by the death of its first president, and Hitler took that as a moment to set his sights on new conquests. And this was all done without the permission of the new Czech president. It was a deal that was negotiated by Neville Chamberlain. And people who lived, Jews and anti-Nazis who lived in the northwest section of Prague, had to get out immediately because it would be Nazified within 24 hours. So my father, who had just taken a day-long series of medical examinations and didn't know that all this was happening while he was taking his exams, stoked himself on coffee and rented a cab and went to the northwest section of Czechoslovakia to bring his mother and his aunt to safety, which was presumed to still be, it was still a safe destination to come to Prague. And my father grew up in that northwest section of Czechoslovakia. When Paul arrived at 16 Weltmühlstrasse just before midnight, the curtains of the Heller family apartment were drawn. Elsa Heller was seated on the sofa in the front sitting room, which was lit by candles. There were rumors of bombing, she told Paul, and she'd been advised to turn off all the electricity. She was dressed formally, her long hair, still jet black at 54, gathered in a bun at the back of her neck. In front of her, the marble-topped coffee table was piled with books, clothes, and open boxes of photographs and letters. On the floor next to her sat her suitcase and handbag. She was clutching a small paper bowl laminated with pictures of seabirds that Eric had made for her when he was a boy. "You have to put candy in it in order for it to be balanced," she said as she looked up at Paul, her face ashen. "Kind of like me," Paul said, trying to bring lightness to his voice to avoid frightening his mother any further. "I must tell you that Cousin Fanny had yesterday out of the blue a tonsils operation," she went on, making conversation as she always did when she was nervous and upset. "Lena and Carl came by and told me she was in hospital. The cab is waiting, Mother, we must go." "Do you remember when Eric cut his finger making this bowl?" she asked, running her hand across its bumpy, varnished edge. "He made a frightful fuss, a most terrible fuss. Do you remember that?" Elsa's eyes were cavernous. "Mother, you'll feel better once you're in the cab." "You must let me decide how I feel," she said sharply. "I didn't have time to withdraw money. I haven't selected what I must take. I haven't sorted through Father's books. I cannot go. Perhaps tomorrow." She sat stiff and delicate, her coat draped over her lap. "Mother, we can do that from Prague. Annie can help us. She can send things." Elsa's eyes roamed over the room, returning to the open boxes on the table. She fingered Eric's paper bowl again. "Have you eaten?" Paul nodded. "But you'll have a bite of something with me, no?" "We haven't the time, Mother. We'll eat at Minna's." He stood motionless in front of her for several moments, then moved toward where she sat. "Mother, we must leave. We must go now. Please let me help you." He spoke in a stern and unequivocal tone he'd never used with her. He felt the blood go to the back of his neck. Elsa Heller was a tiny woman, standing under 5 feet, but over that height she was solidly built. Paul put his hand under her forearm, but she rose on her own, went down the hall to the kitchen, and came back carrying the silver butter mold that Alfred's parents had given them at their wedding. She added it, along with the bowl, to one of the boxes, applied a few drops of cologne from a bottle in her handbag, and stooped to blow out the candles. Without looking at Paul, she laced her arm in his and let him lead her down the steps and out the door into the drizzly open night. The street, which rarely saw traffic, was filled with cars and taxicabs. The route to Ida's apartment took them past Paul and Eric's gymnasium and the candlelit apartment where the parents of Paul's childhood friend, Camilo Fleischer, the only other Jewish boy in his gymnasium class, lived. He wondered what Camilo and his family were planning to do. The taxi climbed the hill past the Comitau Kino and the music hall where Paul and Eric had taken part in the children's theater, and Dr. Fleischman had conducted the Comitau Orchestra, and continued past Bobby Komish's haberdashery, Mendel's bookstore, then across the railroad bridge and past the old iron ore quarry, all until that night, the unquestioned constants in Paul's life. Tante Ida was waiting in the alcove doorway of her building, a small suitcase by her side. She was dressed warmly, the tight lace collar she always wore to Saturday services visible under her jacket. Du bist so tüchtig, Pauli, the diminutive 68-year-old said in the authoritative tone in which she issued all her judgments. It was the highest accolade one could receive from Tante Ida, level-headed, able to get things done. Paul put her bag next to his mother's on the front seat. The two women sat in back on either side of Paul in their rain-moist fur jackets, their small spectacles glinting in all directions as the cab followed traffic toward the main road for what was usually a 2-hour ride back to Prague, but likely would take far longer tonight. The windows were open just enough to let the smells of exhaust and wet pavement in. The honking and screeching of brakes in the middle of the night had a surreal quality. Elsa loosened the laces on her shoes. Through the rear-view mirror, Paul could see in the distance the dim lights of other Sudetenland towns nestled at the foot of the mountains. No one exhaled a normal breath. The only words came from the taxi driver, who talked about God. That day he'd become convinced for an absolute fact that there was none, he said. In the silence, he made weak, worried jokes. How can anyone take the Nazis seriously? They march too much. Just before dawn, as the rain was ending, they arrived at Walter and Minna's apartment. Grandma Minna, whose sense of humor was legendary, poured hot coffee from a silver urn that sputtered more than flowed. My ribald friends regard this coffee pot as having prostate trouble. It has a problem, it has a problem. She declared with a great heave of a laugh, pretending, like the taxi driver and like Paul, to a sense of normalcy that she surely did not feel. She poured thick, pulpy orange juice, which Paul, awakening to his body for the first time since he'd walked out of the examination hall over 15 hours before, drank with such voraciousness that it dribbled over his chin. As the sun came up, Minna enlisted Elsa and Ida's advice on the cooking of eggs for their breakfast, and a debate, led by Tante Ida, about the best way to fry them followed. That night, instead of returning to his dormitory, Paul collapsed on the sofa in the room that his mother and aunt now occupied, listening to their short, shallow breaths as they slept. The world, which for so long in his mind had looked one way, had begun to look totally different. Well, I want to take you from Prague to Riverside, Illinois, which is jarring, believe me. This is a section from part 2. Part 2 is called The Unthought Known, which implies the degree to which children know what they don't know. They absorb something that they don't realize they know. And this little section is called The Brick, and it is about that moment when I knew something I didn't know I knew. I became a shark in the summer of 1957, just months after I'd been sick. I had a encephalitis when I was a little girl, and it came right after this. or I was sick right before this. I'd begun that summer as a minnow, and then, along with another 7-year-old girl, having made the most progress in the Riverside Summer Swimming Program, was promoted to the rank of shark. I walked through the corridor of mandatory showers, my bare feet slapping the puddles gathering on the tiles, and stood for a moment in the arched entrance to the pool, where the still water and the clean, cold air felt otherworldly. Today, the last day of the summer season, my mother would be in the bleachers watching me. After the minnows, fish, and flying fish performed their kicks and strokes, wrapped themselves in towels, and joined their families in the bleachers, the sharks lined up along the deep end and dived in, swimming 2 lengths of the pool in the hushed peacefulness of the water. The feel and sound of my sturdy rhythmic strokes filled me with joy. At the end of our laps, the athletic director, Mr. Perkins, his sports medallion shimmering in his dark chest hair, grabbed the microphone he used for just this day and announced my name and that of the other little girl whose swimming had most improved. He knelt down between us as he explained, the words amplified through his microphone, that both of us would dive into the deep end, and whoever retrieved the 3-pound rubber brick from the bottom of the pool would be the 1957 summer champion and receive a trophy. After that moment, I have no memory of the other little girl. I dived in, the cold water seeping under the edge of my bathing cap, as my arms and hands pulled my body down toward the shadowy dark object below. I took firm hold of the brick in my left hand, allowing my stronger arm and hand to power me to the surface of the pool and my triumph. Mr. Perkins pulled me from the water and held up the black rubber brick to the audience as the emblem of my victory. To a loud current of applause coming from the bleachers, he then presented me with a trophy. A small golden girl with a tiny face of barely discernible features, standing on a vanilla white pedestal poised to dive. My pride was so great it was almost painful. Scrunching my eyes against the light coming through the windows above the bleachers, I found my mother's face. She was glancing right, then left, as if seeking confirmation from the mothers sitting around her that this great event had really happened. When she looked toward me, her face was awash in tears. Even as in a separate corner of my mind I replayed every thrilling stroke that had propelled me from the bottom of the pool, now, seeing my mother's face, I could scarcely breathe. Her tears seemed earth-shaking, as if my performance had represented the clear condition of everything she needed. Before my dive, I hadn't known that I possessed the strength that had won me this prize, and now in a flash I felt my own realization taken from me, engulfed by the intensity of my mother's emotion before I could claim it as my own. Trying to hold myself tall, to step back into the exaltation I'd felt a moment before, I smiled at her, but what I'd felt was gone. Replacing my pride came an anguish deeper than anything I had words for. Achingly devoted to her, I did not have it in my power to think, much less to say, I'm not really this strong. I will not always be able to do this. I will disappoint you. It was the first time I remember wanting to grow backward into tininess, into invisibility. On the drive home, my thighs damp against the hot vinyl car seat, my trophy lying on the seat between my mother and me, the responsibility I felt to make her happy, to make both my parents proud, was too great for my body to hold. I started to cry so hard that my nose began to bleed. I know it's kind of hard to come back from being in Prague and in the high school swimming pool with me to asking questions and conversation, but I really enjoy that part of this. So please do feel free to comment or question. Gail?
You have to, first of all, repeat the question for the webcast. But my question is, did they talk about it at all? In the book, you talk about some of your research. Could you talk about how they talked about the experiences and how you filled in the rest of it?
Yes.
Repeat the question.
Gail asked how my parents talked about the past and how I filled in the rest of it. They didn't. As Jody knows, we grew up, my brother and I grew up in a very Christian Republican suburb, and my parents, like so many refugees, particularly of that time, but certainly now as well, were trying to figure out how to assimilate. And the whole idea of a melting pot, although I don't think that was the term in the 50s, was very appealing, and they somehow felt they really didn't need to talk about being Jewish or to talk about the past, and that was the way to go forward. So they talked very rarely. What my brother and I knew was, what we were told was, that my father had been a prisoner, and the implication was that he'd been a soldier. And we just knew not to ask questions. We were told that our grandparents both our grandfathers had died of heart attacks. And things were coded over. Tom, my brother, and I never really knew if this was just sort of a developing habit, that my parents just little by little things didn't get talked about, or whether it was a deeply conscious decision to never talk about it. But that is how we were raised until a moment in the book when my brother had already gone to college and I was in my later years of high school. One of my classmates is here from Riverside. Things started to come out. There was a moment in a high school class when my teacher asked, is there anyone in the class who's Jewish? Because a classmate whom I was actually very fond of had made a virulent anti-Semitic remark, and I felt my blood boil. And I was a very shy, quiet kid, and I just wanted to read him the riot act, and we kind of started sparring, and my American history teacher stopped it and said, I need to know if there's anyone in the class who is Jewish. And I had a total out-of-body experience, in part because I was frightened, and in part because I realized I somehow didn't know the answer. But again, it was sort of an unthought known, and I did know the answer too. So that was a pivotal moment, as I remember it. Ironically, I don't remember what happened after that. If I went home and said to my parents, what's going on here? Funny how the mind works. When they got older, as Jody knows, more and more came out, to the point where a lot came out. And I was lucky enough to have my father well into his old age, and everything started to pour out. This whole scene with my grandmother and my great aunt, he said he would have such a hunger to talk about it that he would come out again after he talked about it. He said, I remember my mother untied her shoes. I don't know why she untied her shoes, and what the cab driver said. And my mother, who died of a brain tumor, and we knew it was a terminal illness, I taped her stories before she died, and I have about 12 audio tapes. But Gail, much of the early story I have to imagine. I did an enormous amount of research and have everything kind of down about what happened, but of course, what you said about feeling like you were in the coffee houses, one has to add dialogue, one has to do a bit of imagining to bring all the textures in to make it a story, and I did some of that, although so many of the details were from my mother and father, and from, as someone's here, Susie Cohen-Evans, who knew my uncle very well. He has an archive at Northwestern University, so there were many archival records as well.
What did you do with those tapes? Did you copy them and give them to the Holocaust Museum?
No, I'm slowly becoming willing to give things up. I've given a lot of things to my brother's children, and I will do that. That's an excellent suggestion. Other comments? Yes, sir.
How did you get started in writing the book, or what was the inspiration to put it into a book form?
This gentleman asked what was the inspiration to put it in book form. Well,
I'm just going to identify who's raising their hand.
got it. Yes. There was a pivotal scene when my mother was dying, where my uncle, and I knew, my mother told me when I was a teenager, late in my teens, that Eric had been her sweetheart before my father was. But I had never seen sparks between my mother and my uncle. I more felt combustion, not that kind of spark, but more like anger almost, that kind of energy. But when my mother was dying, Eric, who lived in Evanston, my mother died at Evanston Hospital, came to her room almost every day and read to her from the Claudius book. And that was a moment when I thought, where I really registered, there was this life that was kind of the real life, and I wasn't there. And I registered their relationship, and I think that I thought I need to one day write their story. Then I went, and one of my upper class people, I always loved to write, and I really wanted to develop my writing chops. And I went to an MFA. I got a grant to do some research, and I used the money to get an MFA at Bennington. And at Bennington, I met Sven Burkertz, a very fine literary critic, who was my first teacher there. And I didn't know who he was, and so I went to the Bennington Library because I thought I should brush up on my teachers. And what do I find but a book that by Sven that contains an essay about Eric Heller. So I had enormous transference with Sven. I could barely speak with him for the first week at Bennington, but he was a great admirer of Eric's work, and he basically said, you've got to write this story. And that's when I really started in on it.
I don't know how to articulate this, but in the book, the letters that were written at the same time from Eric to your mother and from Paul really show the character so completely of the two different men. And I wondered how you felt about that when you had privy to that, because I felt that Eric was so superficial even though he was brilliant. And here's Paul suffering and trying to survive. I was very moved by those letters. And I wondered, could letters be sent out of these concentration camps? How did they arrive?
Yeah.
Repeat the question.
Phyllis asked about the sort of one of the center chapters in the book that's pretty much all letters, juxtaposed my uncle's letters to his amour, who was a soldier, and my father's diary entries, and how I came upon those letters. Let me say first that was an incredibly difficult chapter to write because, number one, I didn't feel as the next generation, and I think so many people feel that way, what right do I have to write about the war? I felt like I could manage to write about before the war and after the war, but the war is so not mine, and who on earth is able to write well about it. I also had, from being my parents' daughter and not my uncle's daughter, so I had I was very close to my uncle in certain ways, but not in the ways I was to my parents. And I didn't admire him as much as many people did because of what I found out. And because of that, I don't know if I would call it superficiality, Phyllis, although it's an interesting term. I would more a kind of a above-it-allness. Maybe that is what superficiality is. He doesn't sort of need to be like all the rest of us. So I was trying, of course, when one writes a book, one has to be fair to everybody. It's not interesting to write a book about the difficulty Caroline has with her uncle. So I decided I needed to just let the documentation of those years come from the people. Those letters from my uncle to Graham Story, who was his first boyfriend, spoiler alert, are in the archive at Northwestern. Why the letters from my uncle to Graham are there, I don't know. Because one would think Graham's letters to my uncle would be there. I don't know why they are there. I think in their breakup, Graham must have sent my uncle all the letters. I don't know, but I used excerpts from those letters. My father was on a death march, as those of you who read the book know, from Auschwitz back to Buchenwald when the Nazis had the delusion that they could cover their tracks and have these horrifying death marches, and that somehow that would mask what was going on in the concentration camps. And my father obviously survived that death march, but he didn't anticipate that he would, and with great reason. So toward the end of the death march, as the prisoners were being herded into a barn, my father lay down under a farmer's calendar with a pencil tied to it on the wall, and he thought at that moment, they're going to kill me anyway. I am going to stuff this in my pocket and write. And he did. He wrote. I have that calendar. And my father wrote those notes down. And after reading Claudius came out, I got an email from a young woman, my age, very young woman, in Portland, who said, you're the daughter of Paul Heller. My father, this Mary's father, was the chaplain, the army chaplain in Beirut, which was the first place my father kind of stayed for any length of time as he was getting out of Europe. And that chaplain had a very lovely person who was working with him, and she offered to sit with my dad and write up those notes. And I didn't know about that. Mary told me the genesis of how they became clearer, and then he translated them and actually published that diary in Midstream magazine in the mid-'80s.
I mean, it's the kind of thing you could say you could only read in a book. When you mentioned the pencil hanging and the calendar, I felt it too, as Gail did. I thought, my God, how did this appear? It was like just a miracle.
Yes.
He could do that.
Yes.
And then he kept his wits and wrote all that.
Yeah.
That was
Yes.
amazing.
Yeah. He was not the easiest dad, as some people in the room know, but he was an extraordinary. I mean, of all the survivors I've met, my father was really quite a healthy emotionally in so many ways. I mean, in some ways he wasn't. In some, of course, that experience damaged him, but he was extraordinary.
He was very rational.
Yeah.
And passionate at the same time.
Yeah.
I love that story.
Yes, Marcia.
First, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And second, it's so intensely personal. I'm wondering whether there were times when you found it very difficult to continue writing it, and if so, how did you overcome that and just keep going? In addition to Sven's encouragement and also the memories of your parents.
Yeah. I wrote an essay about my father. It's now, a version of it is now the last chapter of the book. It's called Optolens, when he was kind of getting diminished, in part because he was losing his sight. And my stepmother had gone on a trip, and so I was alone with my father, sort of tending to him for a couple of weeks, and he was driving me absolutely crazy. And so I wrote little notes about his experience trying to learn how to use a reading machine that would help him to see. And at Bennington, I was encouraged to really work that piece because it was quite good. And when my father was on his deathbed, my older brother said, read him that piece, and I thought, absolutely not. It's sort of warts and all. I don't want this to be my parting gift, but I always do what my brother tells me to do. So I did, and in the middle of it, I thought, this is awful, because my father had no expression, and but I sort of couldn't stop. I was in it, and toward the end, he got a little this mischievous grin that Jody knows so well, and said, Caroline, you should submit this somewhere. And I did after he died, and it was published. And an agent read it and contacted me, and I got a contract within a few days from Random House. Crazy good fortune, so I had to write the book. But that certainly doesn't mean that it was in any way easy. I alluded to it with Phyllis's question about how difficult that center portion was, and the whole thing. You know, that the center portion, when I read my father's Death March diary, and I had read it many times, it was as though someone were, for the first time, telling me, this is what your dad. It was as though I never knew anything about it, the degree to which it absolutely undid me, what he went through. And I thought there was something wrong with me that I would be willing to go into that darkness, but it was also so compelling to do so. So it was very hard. It was very hard to write about myself. This is something, part 2 is all the idea of my editor. I thought I was done about 4 years before I was done, because I was like, here's the story of my parents, and no, you have to be in it. I think it makes it a much better book, but I never anticipated telling my story. I never anticipated coming out to the world. It just, the things one does, that the sort of the momentum of the words, just suddenly you're in a position where you have to do something that you didn't anticipate doing, because the story matters suddenly so much to you.
Thank you.
Anything?
Last one. Did your parents ever visit Czechoslovakia?
Yes, they did, and I was with them. It was in 1982. It was still under communist rule, and it was very emotional. My father, crazily, was detained in the airport because in that myopia of the new regime, the communist regime, basically Hitler never happened. It was never, and according to the police, the airport police, they had no reasonable record of why my father left Czechoslovakia. And he was so pale when he came out of that room. It was so difficult, so strange. But that was the worst part of the trip. Then it was just incredible to be with my parents. And my mother took me to the coffee houses. Many of them are gone, some aren't. And to be able to do that with my parents was just amazing. And my mother got sick shortly thereafter. So it was such a gift.
The house survived, they visited their place where they used to live.
My father visited his house, and there was still his apartment. There was still a little, you could see the imprint of the plaque that had said his Dr. Alfred Heller. And it was.
Well, I'd like to thank you for
Thank
coming.
you
It
so
was a
much.
wonderful- And if anybody wants to buy copies of the book, they're being sold outside, and Carolyn, I'm sure, would love to sign them. And it's really a treat to have an author come and talk about her book. And it was a wonderful book. Thank you. Thank you for writing it. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.